Holy smoke, we're back. It's Alex Wiseman. We're talking about preschool and three cultures revisited, but we're putting a big conceptual framework around it to think about how it can be blended with our ideas and discussion about globalization and contextualization. I'm coming to you from the couch in my home office wearing a hoodie because I have a cold and I'm at home. So pardon me for sniffling. I might sneeze before this is over. In our last In our last screencast, we were just getting to a re-look at some institutional assertions. We'd looked at some of the ways that policy convergence was discussed in the literature because our friends who wrote Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited were emphasizing convergence as one of the things that they were trying to contrast with other theories. Now remember, institutional assertions suggest that social institutions, like schools, profoundly construct the way life is organized. And that, if we look down here, education increasingly dominates the structure of childhood and child rearing. There are few places you're going to see education dominating the structure of childhood and child rearing and profoundly constructing the way life is organized than in preschools. Preschools are a time when in many countries the family is quite close, and that mothers in particular, in most patriarchal societies anyway, have a really close relationship with and responsibility for preschool age children. We also have this idea that mass schooling, that getting kids or people of any age, quite frankly, into schools, sets the stage for the increasing importance of education as an institution. So that the more people are involved in education at earlier ages, like in preschool, the more likely they are to value education as an institution, and put their children into it as well. And so we see some interesting things happening. We have a 20-year time span between the first study for Preschool and Three Cultures in the mid-'80s and the second study, Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited, in the early 2000s, right? So we have about a 20-year time span. That means that we have time for those people who were in kindergarten in the first study to have children in kindergarten in the second study. In other words, we have a generation that has passed. That's interesting. It allows us to actually think about this more tangibly. We had some institutional questions that we asked about homogeneity, about expansion and standardization, about contextualization and impact of a world society or world culture. And we were trying to think about how we could contrast globalization and contextualization, as well as integrate or complement the two by looking at what Preschool and Three Cultures was telling us. And one of the things that we kept hearing about was this convergence idea, right? Which I've already talked about here. Anytime you have two things that lead to a point that somehow converge, this is China, Japan, USA, right? And the way that their preschools were interacting with society in 1984 is different than how how preschools are interacting with society in 2002. And so Tobin, Say, and Kurosawa suggested that one of the answers might be this convergence. But we have other things that we can consider. What about divergence? Maybe they go from China, Japan, and the US to a much wider look. That would be this divergence idea, where here you start and here you end, and the two ends are very far away, very different from one another, right? There would be a divergence in the way that things were happening. Now, what's interesting is, do we see that happening? We have 20 years here, and we know that one of the questions is, because they have told us on page 3, let me get to page 3 and I'll read it to you. Sorry, page 4. Have Chinese, Japanese, and American early childhood education ideas and practices grown more alike since we did our original study in the mid-1980s? And they just set up for us this dichotomy where there was convergence on one end and then craziness on the other. No. And then different ideas about how things change on the other. What we don't see from them is any sort of argument that there has been divergence, that there's been an increasing difference between the relationship between early childhood education and society in any of these countries. That doesn't seem to be, at least in the first chapter and in the China chapter, what Tobin and his co-authors are arguing. We do see convergence set up as a sort of straw man. In other words, they're arguing that this is not happening. They would put a big X over this. And quite frankly, I would too. I think it's very difficult to ever argue for convergence. They don't seem to be talking about isomorphism very much. And isomorphism is an interesting phenomenon. Isomorphism suggests that rather than things converging, things are changing, and they might be changing in ways that are not exactly the same, but that they will somehow align. And so what we have here is an example of how that alignment might occur. And you can see that in some points there's a further distance between the paths that change is taking. And at other points there's a much closer distance between the paths that things are taking, right? And then it might go back to being big again. Who knows? When we think about change, though, isomorphism is just well, I'm going to define it here in a second. But it's when things change and they look more like over time because they've been around in the same set of conditions. It doesn't mean that they converge, though, and it doesn't mean homogeneity occurs. What we haven't seen actually argued very well, anyway, and I suggested in the last screencast, was that we might have a combination. If we have China, Japan, and the United States here, and maybe we have China, the United States, and Japan. I'm just going to make it crazy, right? And the path to change might go like this. Now, in each of these cases, there is going to be a difference. There's going to be some moving together and some moving away. So, for example, China and Japan are further apart. They end up more different than they start. But the way they got there kind of looks alike. It just happens to be that the distance started increasing over time. And the opposite can also occur. China and the United States end up much closer together. End up much closer together. But the path that they take still somehow mimics each other. Mimic isn't the best word because that is a particular kind of change. But it's a shared way of changing, even though it's not exact. Now, why don't we think about this as a combination? We've got divergence, we've got convergence, well, actually we don't have convergence. We've got divergence, we've got isomorphism. Convergence just doesn't happen. Now, one of the things that a lot of people miss, and I'm going to say this because I have experienced it, is that there are particular elements of institutional theory that actually never suggest homogeneity is achievable, although there is mention of homogeneity being something that might contextualize a particular change process. I know that sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but let me explain a little bit. There are three key elements of institutional theory: scripts and models, legitimacy seeking, and then this idea of coupling. The idea of scripts and models is that there is a particular shared set of expectations for what, in this case, education, or even more specifically for Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited, early childhood education looks like. And that those shared expectations are somehow transferred from society to society. In the case of Tobin and his co-authors, they're arguing that borrowing and lending of foreign educational ideas is the way that these scripts and models sort of travel the world, especially between China, Japan, and the United States. Now, the reason why these foreign educational models change is not necessarily always articulated very well, but a lot of it has to do with something articulated very well, especially by Tobin and his colleagues. A lot of it has to do with something called legitimacy seeking. Why are these scripts and models seen to be worth copying or worth forcing or worth moving towards? Why do they have value? Well, I can tell you this. It's not always because they're the best way. It's not always because they're the best practice. It often is because these scripts or models have legitimacy. And they usually have legitimacy because they represent a particular social, political, or economic system, ideology, whatever. And so when we read Ramirez and Bolai last week, when they looked at the European spread of mass education, they argued that legitimacy seeking, although I don't remember if they used that term exactly, that the scripts and models that spread were legitimate because they represented particular ideas about individuality and progress. And they gave some historical reasons why, in that European context, ideas about individuality and progress had so much legitimacy. The problem is that no two places are ever exactly alike. They don't have the same context, they don't have the same people, they don't have the same history, they don't have the same resources, etc., etc. I mean, the list is never ending of things that are not the same. And so even though there are scripts and models that might travel, that might be borrowed, that might be lended, and for reasons of legitimacy, which, by the way, even though they might be misguided, are valid reasons, right? Even though they might end up wrong or might end up hurting a community, there's still valid reasons for borrowing. But the loose coupling that occurs, or in some cases the decoupling that occurs between the model and the practice, is extremely important. And what institutional theory doesn't do is it does not go into a huge amount of detail explaining the gap between, let's say, the gap between policy and practice. And this is a big gap. It's like a river, a big, dark, scary gap between policy and practice. What institutional theory doesn't do is it doesn't explain what this gap looks like, or what exactly are the mechanisms for this gap. What it does say is that policy and practices that are set up will often follow scripts and models. The outcomes of policy and practice will often be very different. Very different. That's interesting. Not necessarily touched on by institutional theory, but is interesting. And I think that's where Tobin and his co-authors are going with this. I think that they're saying that there's a huge gap between the models and the outcome, between the policy and practice models and what actually happens, right? And they're saying that we don't see convergence between policy and practice, or between policy and practice and their outcomes. We don't see that. You'll never see that in this book. That's interesting, right? But it's not surprising, because there are different ways of thinking about how change takes place, and we're really talking about change. And I mentioned that we talk about isomorphism a little more, so let's talk about it. Isomorphism is a constraining process that forces one unit in a population to resemble other units that face the same set of environmental conditions. Well, we've got a couple of things that we can notice right off the bat. We've got constraining, we've got forcing, and we've got resembling, given a particular set of environmental conditions. There are a lot of characteristics of isomorphism that limit what it does. Right? It's a constraining process, meaning that there are boundaries beyond which a particular organization or individuals within an institution cannot go. So if you think of it this way, a preschool teacher has a particular way that they are expected to act. Right? And there is, if we take the institutional approach, there is a model or a script for what that is. And it's pretty broadly defined, because it's going to be a little bit different in China and in Japan and the United States. However, I think we all would agree that there is a definite difference between the way that a preschool teacher acts and the way that an infantry soldier acts. Right? In one situation, we have people who are interested with the care and the nurturing and the development of young people, usually really small, tiny young people. On the other hand, we have people whose job is to take orders and to fight. Very different. Right? There must be a boundary that constrains what a preschool teacher is, that prevents it from becoming an infantry soldier. So if we think about it on that big level, we know that there's a boundary, there's a constraining process. But we also know that there's variation that occurs. So the way that Preschool teachers act in these different countries and these different systems will vary based on where they are. We're going to pause here. We're going to come back. We're going to finish talking about isomorphism, and we're going to move more into preschool in three cultures revisited. See you soon.